Earlier, we told you the UK's Ministry of Defence intelligence briefing reiterated that Russia's efforts are now on the eastern states of Donetsk and Luhansk, known as the Donbass region. And noted the fighting has been particularly heavy around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, and that there had been an attempted advance southwards towards Sloviansk. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says around 8,000 British Army troops will be joining a series of exercises across Europe this summer in one of the largest deployments since the Cold War. Our correspondent in London, Juliana Olaika, joins me now for more. Juliana, great to see you. Let's begin with the Defence Secretary's announcement, the deployment of 8,000 troops across Europe. It does connote, however, that Britain is preparing for eventualities with Russia, right?
Yes, good morning, Amarachi. It does appear as we're entering into the third month of the war that the dialogue and the sentiment from the West is shifting. And we heard this a couple of weeks ago after the Easter recess when the Prime Minister was speaking at the dispatch box. And I think it's important to note that every single time the Prime Minister is speaking about Russia, he is very, very careful with his words because, of course, Britain has found itself the leader of this Western alliance. And it started off with sanctions, but it's ever so more increasingly seeming to be a military partnership. That's what we're hearing from Russia. And certainly from this deployment yesterday, as you just mentioned, an 8,000 strong troop battalion being sent to the Estonian-Latvia border is increasing. I think if you listen to the headlines, it does appear that the West would like to believe that the Russia is not gaining strength, but clearly that isn't the case. They are pushing forward, despite the fact that Ukraine is armed to the teeth by NATO allies' defence equipment, but still it is not relenting. So yes, Britain are sending this 8,000 strong troops to the border under an operation dubbed Exercise Hedgehog. They are going to be joining the 18,000 NATO forces that are currently on ground. And just to mention, Amarachi, something that's been reported quite heavily in the British press this morning, as it has been confirmed that the first British soldier has been killed in Ukraine. This is the first one that we know about. It's a 36-year-old man called Scott Silby. I believe he was once working with the British Army. We know very early on in the beginning of the war, President Volodymyr Zelensky was calling on former soldiers from across the world, particularly in the West, to come and join the forces. Many British soldiers were doing that, and we have had the confirmation yesterday evening that one British soldier has been killed on the ground, 36-year-old Scott Silby. Also as well, we're hearing that 2 British aid workers have also been captured. I'm sure it was discussed extensively on this show that there are also 2 British soldiers who are currently prisoners of war. How are Britain going to react to that? That is going to be a huge issue because, as you just said, we heard from the Russian spokesperson. We also heard from the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, saying that the West are getting a little bit too close. How far will Britain go in its defence, in its partnership with Ukraine when the potential of a nuclear gunfire is certainly really high? So yes, 8,000 troops are being sent. We've had the confirmation that the first British soldier has died in Ukraine, and it is going to be really palpable now once we hear from Prime Minister Boris Johnson to determine just exactly how far Britain is prepared to go to ensure the safety of Europe.
Indeed, Juliana, that really changes everything, doesn't it? The approach to the war, which has been fought by proxy, and then the Russian president's threat to UK NATO allies, even to the United States, saying, you know, they will pay consequences for helping Ukraine. I know leaders are watching closely the Secretary General's visit to Turkey to Russia as well as to Ukraine. Shortly after Mr. Guterres' visit, there were airstrikes, missile strikes, beg your pardon, in Kyiv. Has the UK government reacted to that? I mean, Prime Minister Boris Johnson was in Kyiv just a few weeks ago. So has he said anything? And has the government responded, to what's happened lately?
We're yet to get an official comment on the ground from either Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, or Downing Street. But as you said, yes, there was that shocking missile strike in Kiev just when the UN Secretary General was in town. I believe 3 people were wounded in that missile attack. And the Ukraine have called it a postcard from Russia. Zelensky said that this strike was an attempt by the Russians to humiliate the United Nations and their stance against this bombardment, and also to show that this war now and the negotiations with Russia are just not working. I think the West and the United Nations, particularly this historic visit by Guterres, would have potentially been able to deter Putin and to deter Russian soldiers. Clearly, that's not been the case.
We do seem to be having problems with Juliana's feed. Juliana,
thank you. There are very, very, very significant heavyweights that sit on the P5, that sit in the Security Council, that do not share the same sentiment as the West feel. India being one of them, China being one of them. Lots of British commentators were really upset that during Prime Minister Boris Johnson's visit to New Delhi for those diplomatic and economic talks with Narendra Modi, the Indian leader, that he didn't push him much harder on him trying to abate this significant crisis. But this is going to lead to some really hard questions about what happens next. We know that even President Joe Biden, who has been, I would say, less vocal in terms of trying to lead this alliance, he was urging Congress last night to put a further $36 billion into this fight with Russia. So no official statement on the record yet about these airstrikes in Kiev when they knew that Antonio Guterres was in town. But certainly it does show that the negotiations and the diplomatic approach that the West has tried to take thus far is not working, which is why we are now starting to see this change of tone. We're seeing the deployments from troops on the ground. You mentioned the German parliament overwhelmingly passing that law to now start sending heavy military bombardments into Ukraine. And we'll just have to see how this turns out over the next couple of days.
Yeah, and quite significant, that the missile strikes are happening when Antonio Guterres was visiting. No other world leader has experienced that. Because he represents the rest of the world, which is why it is even more significant. Julian, I just want to follow up on those refugees expected in the UK from Ukraine and if they have started arriving and what the update is.
Yes, they have. So the Homes for Ukraine scheme, a really late scheme that in terms of Britain, again, wanting to be the leader of the Western alliance and being a strong ally to Volodymyr Zelensky, they have been in terms of finance, in terms of delivering the ambulances, the fire engines and all of the aid that they need. But in terms of getting the refugees in the ground, Britain have been very, very slow. Homes for Ukraine is some sort of sponsorship scheme that's littered with bureaucracy and checks and balances. It was launched about 6 weeks ago now. According to the latest data from the Home Office, about 71,000 visas have been approved via this scheme, but thus far only about 21,000 Ukrainians have been able to come into this country and into Britain's home. And if you compare that to the millions of people that are currently in places like Hungary and Poland, the number is pretty palpable. In fact, there were some protests outside Parliament earlier this week from humanitarian Britons who were really disappointed that despite seemingly passing all the checks, they haven't been successful in being able to house some of these refugees. So I think the British government have been pretty lucky and fortunate that they've been helping in so many ways. That the fact that they're not taking this refugees in abundance hasn't really been talked much about in the global press. But I think 21,000 refugees is a pretty shocking number, considering the bulk of this crisis is being felt in Eastern Europe by countries that are not as wealthy as Britain.
Yeah, and I'm sure the criticism is even heavier because of the new migrant policy, the plan signed with Rwanda to send refugees back to the country.
It absolutely is. In terms of this Rwanda scheme, which is a little bit of a red herring, but it is important because it does discuss Britain, because Britain is a very small island. Britain does have its own domestic challenges. Unfortunately, the cost of living crisis is particularly acute to Britain because of Brexit. Inflation is running at a 3-decade high. The International Monetary Fund has put Britain as being the worst economic performer next year in the G7. And there are local elections taking place next week. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has a lot to juggle with. And he knows that because of his overwhelming success at the ballot box in 2019, the majority of Britons voted for him because they wanted to get Brexit done. And Brexit was about shutting borders, essentially. So they've opened it slightly for the Ukrainians. But when it comes to the serious issue of refugees coming across the channel into Britain, the government have decided that sending them off to Rwanda is the best thing to do. That has come up under intense scrutiny, criticism. There have been so many words that have been floating about, ungodly being one of them. The British government are going to face significant legal challenges. There are two legal challenges that have been put forward to the High Court, which Priti Patel and the government are going to have to tussle with. But there are lots of domestic issues that Britain are going through at the moment. Another one of them is the sleaze that is engulfing Westminster at the moment. A Tory MP viewing very inappropriate material in the House of Commons in front of female staff. A couple of Tory MPs in the past couple of weeks have faced criminal charges for indecent behaviour with minors. There is a lot going on at the moment, which is why some observers, Amarachi, are worried that perhaps Boris Johnson, trying to go head-to-head with Putin, has bitten off more than he can chew. If Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat is only true by 1%, that 1% is a significant issue to Britons and Britain, especially when, unfortunately, Britain is run by headlines that don't necessarily tell the truth. Russians are making significant progress, and unfortunately, Britain is at the right front and centre of this Western alliance. So if anything does, flare Russia in the wrong direction, it could have serious consequences for the millions of people that live in this country.
Juliana, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. Great analysis you have provided this morning. Thanks again. See you later.
Thank you, Amarachi. Thank you.